So why don't we get started? Thanks to everybody for coming down for our third panel or presentation on planning and policy for majority-minority communities. This one will be a little bit different in that we've kind of stacked the front with 3 people instead of 1, so that could be good or it could be bad. We'll see. But it also is a reflection of what I hope is a little bit more of a conversational kind of approach to this. And what we'll do today is have 3 hopefully fairly brief presentations, but initiate a conversation. And the reason why I wanted to have this kind of a conversation within our planning group, but also open to the broader university, and for those of you who are not in planning, I want to welcome you here to sort of see what we're doing and how it relates to some of the very current issues around criminal justice. It stems from a couple of conversations that I was part of and saw while at the Planning National Association meetings in Philadelphia earlier this year. And some of my colleagues from California and Louisiana and New York, they kind of, in passing, and also Hawaii, actually were mentioning that a lot of the communities that we work in as planners, community planning, community development finance, all this kind of stuff, there's a lot of things going on there that have nothing explicitly to do with planning, but are really important in terms of understanding the communities, right? So poor communities, you know, most of the people that my friend in Louisiana was working with, they have at least 2 or 3 family members that are currently in jail, right? To say nothing of the number of family members and friends that are stopped by the police all the time, right? And that's not something that is one of our concentrations in most planning departments, but it certainly affects what we do. And it certainly affects the mindset that some of the communities we work in come to the table with in terms of how they want to engage with people that work for a local government planning agency, with people that work for a nonprofit, or whatever. And what I see this as is kind of experimental in trying to intersect some of the planning frameworks with some of the criminal justice and legal studies kinds of debates that are really talking about the same communities. How do we see things as similar, and how do we see things as different? So with that, I want to take a moment to introduce 2 people that I know very well. The first is my sister, who is not pure nepotism that she's here. It's because actually she's done a lot of really interesting work within the legal system, and in particular in civil rights. So Mylyn Spencer, she's worked as an advocate for sexual assault and domestic violence in Seattle. She got a degree from JD from New York University School of Law. She spent 5 years working in the Criminal Justice Division of the Department of Justice, investigating and prosecuting primarily police and prison abuse cases. After that, she worked as in capital and non-capital defendants investigation in California for the state, and is currently at the UC Hastings College of Law as running the Civil Justice Clinic and the externship program, and also teaches at the Bolt School of Law at Berkeley and teaches about evidence. Now that's something I hope we can have as an interesting part of the conversation, is what constitutes evidence, and maybe we can ask a little bit about why sometimes what seems to be clear evidence from a layperson's point of view actually is not really evidence in the legal standpoint, or from a legal standpoint. Also right here, I'd like to introduce Arthur Ago, who is the Chief of the Trial Division of the Public Defender Service in the District of Columbia. He oversees 50 attorneys assigned to represent indigent people charged with crimes in Washington, D.C. A lot of them are homicides and sexual assaults. He's been at the Public Defender Service since 1998 and has done a lot of work with universities and teaching law clinics. Has a master's in Asian American Studies from UCLA and a BA from Amherst College, as well as a law degree from George Washington University in DC. Okay, with that brief introduction, what we'll do is I'll give a little bit of a presentation about the links between planning and criminal justice. And the link is really the communities that we're both serving. And then Arthur will go next, and he'll talk a little bit about his experience using some anecdotes, but also some background information and frameworks. And then Len will also complement that from her perspective in the Department of Justice experience. And it's a real opportunity to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how our criminal justice system is operated, right? Where does it work? Where does it not work? And I think from our planning standpoint, it really can provide a window to why planning may be very important for picking up where the legal system cannot pick up. And that's become very apparent in recent events. So let me just sort of start off with some of the things that I'm sure you've all seen and maybe have followed, and I'm sure everybody has an opinion on. But criminal justice is a big thing in the US, right? And it has very important racial, ethnic, and gender dimensions. So here, Eric Garner, Staten Island, 2014, right? He's a big guy. He's in the northern part of Staten Island selling cigarettes on the street that he's been doing for a long time. Somehow a situation got out of control with 5 or 6 police officers in a way that they used techniques that, whether they were banned or not, he ended up dying. Somehow a very small infraction that is questionable in terms of whether he should have been picked up or stopped at all on the street, it ended up with the loss of a life. Even more remarkable is that the case did not make it to trial, even though there's videotape, and so it's so obvious that the cause of death was the police action, but it's really unclear how the results that we saw after the fact came to be. In the same year, obviously, earlier this year, Michael Brown. A little bit of a different kind of case, much younger guy. There's no video evidence per se. There's this story about a police officer chasing him and maybe aggressive behavior behind, following on the stop. We don't really know what happens. What we do know is that there was kind of a militarization in the community afterwards, right? And so you see right around on the upper hand left, you have sort of this burning kind of neighborhood, and the whole kind of idea, Black Lives Matter, right? Lives in these communities actually matter. And to get to the point where one has to actually say that is pretty telling in and of itself. Right below that, we have kind of the police response. Now, I think the police department there probably regrets taking such an aggressive military response, but maybe they don't. But that's what happened. You have these kind of paramilitary police officers in that community who respond in a certain way. And you can see that it's not just sort of with regular guns, shotguns, and rifles. It's actually with true military hardware, tanks. And that was one of the criticisms of the police department in Ferguson, Missouri. In response to that, you also have on the upper right-hand corner there, you have these kind of vigilante protection groups that mobilize to kind of protect and keep order from the community side. And they got a fair amount of critique as well. But it kind of created this really violent and tense situation that is still actually playing itself out in terms of what the end result for achieving justice in this situation is going to be. Regardless, it's a community that, the classic kind of comparison of a tinderbox, it really is. It's something where something really just spiraled out of control at the community level based on an event where there was a perceived and probably actual injustice in terms of the interaction between the police and a community member. Lest you think that these things are only happening now, you guys remember 1992? Show of hands, who was 15 years or older in 1992? Okay, so for many in this room, who has heard of Rodney King? Right, Rodney King is the Michael Brown in many ways of a previous generation. And I will say, Rodney King he may have been alive in 1965, but he certainly wasn't beat up in 1965. But the ensuing riots in 1992, or civil unrest, whatever you want to call it, they were almost exactly the same place as what happened in 1965 with the Watts riots, right? It's the same community. It's a triggering event that's new, which is on the left, several police officers beating this guy for speeding and running away from being speeding. And I think it was probably, if I remember correctly, it was, he had been drinking or something. But they really beat him up. And I put that picture on the bottom because it's a little bit of an image of hope. I mean, he was the one who said, can't we get along? Can't we all get along? And he really, I think, is he's got his own personal demons, but he's actually a guy who is thoughtful and is, he's written this book about the riot within and has tried to sort of use his experience to draw attention and bring some light onto these tensions of poor communities and how to kind of improve them. These are not isolated events, and we can't take them as personal interactions. I think as planners and others that are truly interested in what's driving these events and why they happen and why they kind of burst on the scene unexpectedly, you have to understand the geography of policing. You have to understand the geography of what is increasingly a militaristic response to actual and perceived crimes. Let me step out of this PowerPoint for a moment and give you a little bit of a view of something that's coming out of the Urban Studies Department at Queens College in New York. And it's really about sort of the looking at marijuana and sort of low-level drug offenses and use in New York City by race and ethnicity. So this top histogram here is over time you have different categories. Ever used marijuana in your life? Used marijuana in the past year? Used marijuana in the past month? First is the whites, second is blacks, third is Latinos. All right? So it's fairly clear that on a percentage level, consistently, whites are higher users of marijuana. Okay? Now, whatever you make of that, across the board, that is documented in surveys. And there's, it's triangulated by numerous data sets. Now, let's look at arrests, right? Arrests is completely inconsistent with that. Blacks are the worst off, Latinos second off by a long shot, and then whites sort of down here. So it's not simply about drug use, something else is going on. Let's look at the geography of marijuana possession arrest rates, okay? So basically, the shaded areas are high arrest rates at 37% or higher, and low arrest rates is the blank color. Now, if you look at that overlain by the New York City police precincts by race, you'll find that they're almost exactly mirror images of one another, right? There's a couple of places where, over here, precinct 6, you have high arrest rates, but they're actually, it's not very heavily black or Latino. But by and large, there's a pretty good match between the arrests and the demographics of police precincts, right? There's a geographic component to whatever it is that we're seeing in terms of police-community relations. And that's one of the things that I think is really important for us as planning scholars, as planning practitioners, and as generally people interested in planning more broadly need to pay attention to. Let me just sort of, I went on this morning and did one of these online mapping things to see kind of what more contemporary data I can find. I think this was from September to February of this past year. And this is Los Angeles County. And I believe this is the disturbing the peace arrests that are compiled by the city of Los Angeles. Now, I think there's probably something going on with the data because it's so geographically concentrated. But it'll just give you a sense, even if it isn't 100% accurate, of the extent to which these kinds of crimes are clustered in space and in communities. We can look at the drug arrests, drug and alcohol arrests. I accidentally cut it off, but you'll see a similar kind of clustering around these neighborhoods. And these are generally poor and minority communities in Los Angeles. Now, what I want to say is those images that I presented before, we can't just take them as individualized events between one police officer and one individual who's a member of that community, right? There are entrenched community tensions, and these are entrenched community tensions in communities that are changing over time. So this up here on the left is another image from the Los Angeles riots in 1992. That's Reginald Denny. You guys remember or know that name? Who is he? Who's Reginald Denny?
He was a truck driver passing through the area there and pulled out.
Yeah, he was pulled out and beaten up. And later on, he actually became a very kind of like he was very forgiving and understanding, and it was actually, again, like Rodney King, a very positive sign that people understand that there's frustration, that there's conflict, that there's these riots are not unjustified, that they're part of our society, and we need to deal with them. The upper right-hand corner image, that's from Los Angeles, 1965. Quite similar to what you see in 1992, quite similar to what you see in Ferguson. This is not a problem that's new. This is, there are people who are peacefully protesting. Grandma's bringing out her pots and pans and bang, bang, bang. It's not just people lighting things on fire and looting, although that does happen. For those of you who aren't aware much about the Los Angeles riots in 1992, on the lower right-hand corner is members of the Korean community, right? And what was going on at the time? Does anybody have a sense of what was going on in Los Angeles and in South Central and Compton at that time? Adding to the tensions?
Influx of Asian immigrants.
Yes. More specifically, you had Korean business owners, right? They opened shops, grocery shops. They're selling, bread, eggs, fruit, whatever, right? They were the kind of entrepreneurs in these poor neighborhoods. Well, they also got targeted. When rioting happened, looting, they were targeted as being not of the community. And so you had a lot of kind of, again, these vigilante groups organizing themselves to protect their businesses, right? And so there are actually a lot of images with these young Korean men on the rooftops in Los Angeles with guns, sort of as snipers trying to protect the perimeter of their grocery stores. Now, this is not something that is a good thing for communities, right? This is not something that is conducive to community cohesion, and it's certainly not something that allows for planning to take place. It's just these entrenched community tensions that have to do with inequality, they have to do with the police presence and a lack of understanding between the police and the communities, and they also have to do with demographic changes, right? Right now, and even at this time, it was moving this direction. South Central, which has a typically kind of stereotypical kind of image of black Los Angeles, it's mostly Latino. Same with Compton. And Compton used to be all white. It was a white enclave just south of the city of Los Angeles. Then it became all black. Now it's pretty much mostly Latino, right? And actually, if you read some of the stuff from Manuel Pastor, who's did a lot of work on this when the riots were happening, he calls the '92 riots an equal opportunity rioting event in which it was blacks, whites, Latinos, everybody was involved, unlike the Watts riots. So you see changes in the demography of concern, not just in the demography of the neighborhoods themselves. Okay, so what I'm saying is that we need to see these events in communities' context, and in particular the tension between police and community in the context of the structural inequalities and the structural causes of tensions that occur in a community. And this is really important for community planners and others working in these kinds of neighborhoods. So one of the fault lines of that tension is economic. Right? Joblessness, unemployment, right? A lack of businesses, a lack of retail opportunities, a lack of retail businesses to shop at. That's why the Korean economy became so important in those neighborhoods, not just in Los Angeles, but all over the country. Educational opportunities, the collapse of schools in inner cities, right? The funding model for public education in this country really creates incentives for people to flee out of poor neighborhoods, thereby creating a fiscal spiral in terms of the funding model for public education, right? And once you have that fiscal spiral downwards, you create even more incentives for people who can to leave, stranding the people who are least likely to be able to kind of keep a school's scores up, also suffering from low financing, and surrounded by more and more people who have some of the same challenges that they have, right? So it's this kind of cycle in which it passes a threshold in which the school system collapses. And that's something it's been well documented within planning, but it's important in terms of understanding these events, in terms of understanding these tensions between police and communities. Education, employment, we talked a little bit about the economy. Demographic change I referenced in terms of these dynamics between Latinos, blacks, Asians, whites in Los Angeles. And then on top of that, you have community and police relations. And you can't separate out community-police relations from everything else. They're all just part of this knot of relationships that happen within communities, right? And that's why planners become important for understanding what these legal and criminal justice kinds of events result in. Okay, let me just sort of go through some of the stuff. This topic has kind of given me an opportunity to go through some of my prior work when I was living in Los Angeles doing my PhD, and really looking at the neighborhood economy and inequality in the Los Angeles region. And so this is just a map from a long time ago using census and other economic data, looking at the geography of rioting in 1992 after the Rodney King trial. And so if you look, basically the basic key points are the red areas are those neighborhoods with significant riot violence. And by and large, those were poor neighborhoods. You also have those brown areas, which are high poverty neighborhoods that didn't have any rioting, that didn't have any unrest, didn't have that kind of conflict. And the yellow/green is just sort of the rest of the area of analysis. Now, in response to this violence and in response to this kind of crisis in Los Angeles, you had a number of policy and planning responses to that neighborhood inequality, one of which was economic development. There are those who say, we just need the great jobs. Employed people are happy people. Some of the early work that I did was on the Los Angeles Revitalization Zone, which was a tax incentive to promote growth and development in these areas directly as a response to those events of conflict. There was also a program called Rebuild LA. In theory, it made $6 billion available for development projects and business and retail in those areas. In practice, it was very difficult for people to actually get the credit for a lot of underwriting reasons and other kinds of things. And then there were more soft side types of responses where there was support for nonprofit community building. So there's organizations like Operation Hope, Saigu, the Korean Churches for Community Development, all of which took a very proactive role in sort of building individual community relations across the different races and ethnicities in these neighborhoods, but also trying to reach out to the police, right? And if you ask me just sort of qualitatively, in many ways, that's an equally important role that a response can take. Not just the technical aspects of policy and tax credits and trying to channel resources into poor communities. It's actually the soft side of building personal and community relationships. Okay, so let me look at those areas that had violence and those that didn't over a 10-year period after which these policies, or during which these policies were implemented. And this is just purely on the economic side. This is what I did research on a while ago, and so I'm just sort of pulling that back up to the front. So if you look at the employment statistics in 1987, on the left-hand part of that, the bluish column, you have the jobs per square mile in those poor zip codes or those poor neighborhoods where you had a significant amount of violence and unrest. In the middle, you have kind of that reddish column, which is those similarly poor neighborhoods that didn't have the violence. Obviously, you've got a much bigger density of employment in terms of spatial density. There's a lot more jobs and a lot more employed people in that place. And the right-hand side is actually the whole county, all the zip codes in a county, which is much more or less concentrated in terms of employment. Now you go down 10 years later, it's pretty much the same thing. You'll have different total absolute levels in terms of job density, but that's more or less a function of the overall regional economy in 1997. It's not the distribution spatially of that economy. And you basically have the same kind of differences. Those areas that didn't have the violence are those areas that were job rich and employment rich. And those areas that didn't were not. We can look at a similar way, not just in terms of employment and jobs spatially, but as a ratio of the population, right? How many jobs are there per resident, right? So again, if you look at the total employment, those areas where there was violence and unrest, you had much lower levels per capita of employment. You had much higher levels for similarly poor neighborhoods. And interestingly, for the region as a whole, you also had higher levels of employment per capita, right? So it's not just, and then let's look at 1997. You have that a little bit of improvement, but it's still more or less the same. Not that much change over a 10-year period, right? And that's with the tax incentives, that's with the $6 billion of job creation and economic development efforts. And it would be interesting to hear some of our comments from our faculty on economic development planning, because obviously this economic development is a hard thing to do, let alone using it as a tool for improving the relationship between law enforcement and communities, and poor communities. So why I just bring these out is just to show these events that we saw this past year, the events that we saw in 1992, the events we saw in 1965, these are not one-off events. Those are the tip of the iceberg of these really entrenched urban challenges. And what I mean is the geography of inequality in our cities. And I think, I haven't studied Ferguson, but I think it probably would play out in similar ways if you looked at the last 30 years of the geography of the demographics and the geography of the economy. Okay, now that's from 1992, from 87 to 97. That's the past. I think that there's going to be a whole wave of new research in planning and in urban politics and in economics about the geography of inequality, following on what we see in St. Louis, following on what we see in Staten Island and other places. It's an ongoing problem, and there are going to be waves of analysis of this. My real question here is, what do we as planners do? What do we make of this? Because we have a lot of things that we're concerned with in poor communities. We have community planning, community development financial institutions, affordable housing, right? We have economic development that is targeted for poor communities. All of these are really important things. But if I'm a person living in a community that is subject to this kind of tension, what are my primary concerns? And that's what I think planners are not particularly good at understanding, is the context within which they do things like affordable housing, within which they do things like increasing, promoting job growth, promoting economic development, retail opportunities, transportation. We as planners do a bunch of different things, right? We are interested in transportation, environment, social justice, infrastructure, urban services. All of them are efforts that focus on the public good. That's our charter as planners, right? And it takes many different forms. And we focus on communities. And the reason why poor communities are often a focus of planners is because poor communities are unable to pay their way out of these problems of public goods, right? If there's no public water infrastructure and I'm rich, what am I going to do? I'll buy bottled water. If there's no public transportation, what am I going to do? I'll buy a nice car with a TV in it so my kids will be entertained for the 2-hour commute. Or I'll pay into a system where I can sidestep all the traffic problems. Poor communities cannot buy their way out of these problems. And that's why public infrastructure, public goods are so important for poor communities. Other contextual factors, right? Coming back to some of the criminal justice stuff. When we think about poor communities, in the US, we're often thinking about Latinos, African Americans, some segments of Asian American populations, and there's increasingly a poor white community, right? That kind of flies under the radar. All of these populations face some real challenges. So, coming back to some popular statistics, 1 in 3 black males in the US will expect to spend time in prison. Think about it, 33%. You will expect to spend time in prison. That's a daunting thing to face. Over 50% of those incarcerated in federal prison for a felony are Latino in 2011, right? That's a disproportionality. The population of Latinos, I think, is about 15% now, something like that nationally. In 1970, about 100 people were incarcerated per 100,000 in population in the US. In 2010, it's 5 times as much, 500 per 100,000 people, right? That's a big change. The prison economy, right? And you can read a lot of planners are talking about prisons as economic development strategies, rural prisons as economic development strategies. 43% increase in state and federal prisons between 1990 and 2005. Right? This is one of the growth industries of our country. Right? So what do we make of that as community planners? And I want to end by saying that as planners, we need to know more about the challenges facing the individual lives in majority-minority communities. Right? Yes, job growth is important. Housing is important. Finance is important. But in terms of the frontline concerns and frontline trust issues that really affect the way that communities interact with governments, nonprofits, other kinds of actors, and planners of all kinds of sorts interested in the public good, they will be conditioned by these facts. And as planners, we need to understand that, and we need to find ways to negotiate that better. So with that, I want to turn it over to some people who are much more expert than I am in understanding the mechanics of these issues. So let me ask Arthur Ago to come up here, and if I can get his presentation up, then I think we should be in good shape. Is this the one? Yes, that's the one. Yeah. Okay, now do I need to change this here? Yeah. Where is it? Oh. Okay, so put that on your belt. Yeah, that's right. All right, I've always wanted to do that. Yeah, I feel like I'm pinning a Medal of Honor on somebody. All right,
thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Dr. Spencer, for having me. Let me talk a little bit about what I do and who I am, and let me start off with a question for you guys. And the question is, who was Clarence Gideon? Does anybody know who Clarence Gideon was? Anybody? Does anybody know of a case called Gideon versus Wainwright? Tell me what Gideon versus Wainwright stands for.
I just heard it when I was reading. I don't remember the context or anything.
You've heard of the case name? Okay.
I don't remember the details of it. Isn't there a famous book, Gideon's Trumpet?
Gideon's Trumpet. There's a book and a movie about Gideon's Trumpet. Professor Spencer, tell me what Gideon versus Wainwright stands for.
The proposition that you are entitled to an attorney if you are charged with a felony or a capital crime.
Yeah.
You can't afford it.
Yes. If you cannot afford an attorney and you were charged with a crime that was, at the time, a felony or a capital crime, you were entitled to a lawyer for free, paid for by the state. That's what Gideon versus Wainwright stands for. It is a Supreme Court case that resulted in, eventually, the establishment of organizations like mine, in other words, public defenders. So when you see on television somebody reading their Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent. Anything that you say can be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one will be appointed for you. That is where Gideon versus Wainwright ended up. And there is a direct line from Gideon to Miranda to television, right? And so, that's where we come from. That's where the public defenders come from. And that's what we do, is we represent people when they are facing crimes and they can't afford a lawyer. So it's a Supreme Court case. A lot of people know what the Supreme Court case stands for. But who was Clarence Gideon? Clarence Gideon was born in 1910 to a single mother. He had 3 siblings. By the age of, I believe, 13 or 14, he had dropped out of school and he left home and he started living on his own. You can imagine what his life was like and how much he was able to read and write. And so it was a probably difficult life, and he probably couldn't read and write very well. And you can imagine what he had to do to survive, because for someone born in 1910, what is one of the first major national formative influences on him? The 1929 stock market crash, right? And so by 1929, you've got this young man who's walking around trying to find work, can't find work, and then ends up going from job to job, from prison to prison, because he's stealing and mostly burglarizing and trying to make money to survive. By 1962, or 1962, Clarence Gideon is living and working in Panama City, Florida. Where's Panama City, Florida? Anyone? Yes. Yes, Gulf Coast. Where? What part of the Gulf Coast? Next to Tallahassee, right? Not far from Tallahassee. Those counties up there, who did they vote for in the last presidential election? Largely Mitt Romney, right? That's where Clarence Gideon was living. Clarence Gideon breaks into a pool hall and takes some stuff, is eventually arrested, and ends up being jailed and held in jail before his trial. And the reason that he's held in jail is because of his long record that stems all the way back to when he was a child. What happens to Mr. Gideon is he comes to court, he's brought to court for the first time, and he is asked whether or not he's found a lawyer to represent him. What kind of preposterous question is that, right? I mean, it is a ridiculous thing to ask someone who was locked up at the time. No, he hasn't found a lawyer, he wants one. Well, he has to either pay for one or find one himself, and he can't do it, and so he's forced to represent himself at trial, facing a long time in prison because of his prison record, and without the assistance of an attorney. What happens to Mr. Gideon is, of course, he loses at trial. All of you are well-educated people. Can any of you tell me the definition of the legal term hearsay? Anyone? Professor Spencer can tell me.
It's an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted therein. Sorry.
Correct. Obviously, right? And how many exceptions to, hearsay is not permitted in court. How many exceptions to the hearsay rule are there?
A zillion.
There are a zillion exceptions. There is hearsay. There are statements that are made out of court that are called non-hearsay, and there are statements that are hearsay for which there is an exception, and therefore those statements are admissible in court, right? Get it? Clarence Gideon didn't get it, right? All of you are well educated. And if I were to ask you to represent yourselves in court facing burglary charges of a pool hall, having to deal with those rules, it would be very, very difficult. And that's what he was facing. He ends up convicted, of course, spends time in jail, and writes a letter, essentially a letter to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court of the United States looks at this and says, this could be a problem. We will hear argument on it. And what happens then is that for the first time, in this case, a lawyer represents Mr. Gideon. And it's a lawyer from a large law firm, or a couple of lawyers from a large law firm in Washington, D.C. They eventually secure a reversal of his conviction, and he is then appointed a lawyer, because now the rule is he must be appointed a lawyer when he can't afford one, and he wins his trial. That's what happened to, and that's who Clarence Gideon was. That's a long way of saying that what I do is I represent individuals. I represent people that are facing crimes. And so when you think about the criminal justice system, and when you think about demographics and who is arrested and why they are arrested, and the locations of where people are arrested, that is something that impacts my work, but it is not the interest of my work. The interest of my work is my individual clients. And what's important to the individual clients of me and the people that work with me is that we represent what they want. what their desires are. And this is a theme, I think, that is important to this series of discussions, because what the country has been looking at, by and large, is sort of on a macro level, what the relationships are between communities and police, and what the relationships are between the police and different races and people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And part of it, though, is what's incredibly important is who these individual people are and what their goals are in life and how they live their lives. And so when you talk about a case like Gideon versus Wainwright, and you talk about the holding in the case and what the legal proposition it stands for is, one of the things I want to convey to you is it's important who Clarence Gideon was and what he did to get to that point. Having said that, let's talk about the background, the larger areas of the criminal justice system and where and how that specifically intersects with race. And then I'll talk a little bit further about sort of individual examples and how that works. This has been up there for a while. Where does that come from? Anybody? It is the South Carolina Slave Code from 1740. It is sort of self-evident, right? You commit a crime if you are any of one of those categories: slave, free Negro, mulatto, Indian, or mestizo. You commit an economic crime, or essentially you assist a slave to leave the province, you could be put to death. That is from 1740. That is race written into the criminal law essentially at the beginning of our country, right? This is another portion of the South Carolina Slave Code from 1740, and implicit in it is, if any person, meaning any white person, shall murder any slave, etc., they will forfeit money. And then at the bottom, you can see sort of physical abuse that a person like that can inflict upon a slave, and they will forfeit even less money, right? That is sort of the history of where race relations started in this state. Now, I'm not a northerner coming down here to say, you guys, man, you have a messed up history. This is a shared national history, and it continues to be shared among all of the states throughout the nation, right? Certain states had slavery that was legalized. In the North, in cities like Washington, D.C., there continues to be the tension between the criminal justice system and race relations. This is from 1740. Does anybody recognize where this comes from? Somebody said it.
I said the Constitution.
It's the Constitution. What portion of the Constitution?
14.
The 14th Amendment, correct. It is the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution that essentially says enough with disparate treatment, formal disparate treatment in the laws of the races. Equal protection, right? This is ratified in 1868. It results in this 1935 building, which is our Supreme Court, and the motto of the Supreme Court, meaning equal justice under law. So between 1740, just before the birth of our nation, all the way up until essentially 1868, 1935, this piece of architecture, we had in the law the ability to treat people differently based on their race, based on their socioeconomic status. And at this point, the country starts to cleanse the legal system of disparate treatment between races in its articulated form in statutes, in codes, in the law, in the written laws of the country. It still takes the next, between 1868 and I think it's 1972, where we have Loving versus Virginia, which is, you can't marry somebody of a different race. That's the law in Virginia. And in 1972, that was finally over. 67. Thank you. finally overturned. So it's almost 100 years, right, where race is formally written out of the law. That doesn't mean to say that with race-neutral laws, you have equal treatment of the races by race-neutral laws. In Washington, D.C., the percentage of African Americans today is just over 50%, 51% or so. The white population is 39%. You can see that over 80% of the people involved in the criminal justice system are black, as compared to about 14% are white. So there is, in every single law in D.C., and D.C. was one of the first jurisdictions to formally abolish slavery and formally prohibit slavery anywhere within its borders. You still have, to this day, disparate treatment between the races. Jim put up earlier the New York statistics on marijuana. In Washington, D.C., again, you have on the left-hand side there the percentage of population, black versus white, and then the arrests for, it is stark, the arrests for marijuana in D.C., and this is from a period of 2009 to about 2011, and how over 90% of the people who are locked up are black, and fewer than 10% are white. Again, let's not get that confused. The national use of marijuana is more or less the same, and in fact outweighed a little bit more than whites outweighing blacks by a little bit more. And seriously, this is a widespread drug, right? And in terms of the people who are locked up in D.C., you've got over 90%. Who smoked a little weed in the past? Put your hands down. I don't know. I will give you some free legal advice. Never admit to a crime. That's number one. And number two, always ask for your lawyer when you're arrested. So, but the point is that it is prevalent, and the treatment of different people is amazing in Washington, D.C., and how different people are arrested for it. So that is sort of the general background of where we are in terms of how different people are treated differently by the law. One of the things that I wanted to shift towards is to discuss then how this could possibly be and what is happening with police forces. The topic of this discussion has to do with the police and the communities and security, right? And there is an image that the police, at least in Washington, D.C., like to convey, and an image that, and in part it is, sort of a recruiting tool, so that the police will recruit people to join the police force there. But it is also an image that they convey of strength, of security, of taking care of people, right? The 2013 Metropolitan Police Department annual report cover is this, right? That is how the police, it seems to me, like to be seen. This is kind of preposterous if you assume that that is what you want from your police force. Our city is a small city. It's 600,000 people, 650,000 people. It's not a very big city. It's a large metropolitan area with a lot of suburbs and a high population in the suburbs. But it is a relatively small city. This doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. I have been practicing as a public defender there since 1998, so a long time. And you don't really see this. But what you see is police officers prepared to do this. this is sort of unnecessary, and you see police officers prepared to do this. The reality is, in Washington, D.C., from, this is from, I believe, 2013, drug arrests and weapons arrests, knives and guns, you can see in the blue and green portions of this graph, this bar graph. Drug arrests are approximately, they're about 5,700. Weapons arrests are, I think it's around 700, a little bit less than 700. There were 79 homicides in Washington, D.C. in 2013. And so for the police to approach their work in this way is dissonant with these statistics, right? It's more consonant with this image. This is what the police should do. This is how they should portray themselves. And the problem is that when the police convey an image to people in the community, and largely what I'm talking about are the poor communities in Washington, D.C., of sort of this militarized police force, then you set up a relationship with the community that is unhealthy. Now, this also translates into what happens in court and how the police not only approach their jobs on the street, but what they say in court. This is a transcript from a case that is relatively recent, from a couple of years ago. I think it's a robbery case. The person that they're referring to as the defendant was somebody who was stopped on the street because they matched the description of somebody who had committed a robbery against someone, right? And if you take a moment to read that, you can see what the conduct of the police. If you read between the lines, you can see the conduct of the police and the attitude with which they approach this arrest. Everything that they are describing here, and this is a small snippet of the transcript, right? Everything that they are describing here speaks to innocent conduct. The last sentence is illustrative of what I'm trying to say about police attitudes. The person wasn't under arrest at the time, but he was essentially placed in handcuffs for his safety and ours, right? His safety from what? This is a man who's surrounded by police officers. When this officer is saying for his safety, what he is implying is for his protection against us, because we might do something to him. That is, and I can't tell you over the years how many times I've heard police officers talk about that. What happens when somebody's arrested in DC is essentially, for a lot of cases, and essentially for felony cases, a lot of those cases, there is what's called as a preliminary hearing. A police officer is called to testify to describe the circumstances of the incident they are alleging, and then also frequently the circumstances of the arrest. And so we came up to him, we went to talk to him, we detained him, we put him in handcuffs for his safety and ours. It is a common piece of testimony. It's a common refrain from police officers in Washington, D.C. And if the perspective of the police officers is, we have to protect the person we are arresting, right? But what they are not saying is, we have to protect the person we are arresting from us. Because there's no one else there that's threatening this person that they're arresting, right? And this is not to set up sort of a necessary tension between the police and the community when you're talking about the police as a whole and then the community as a whole. What I'm talking about here is how the police are trained. For this piece of testimony to be repeated over and over in time, there must have been a level of training in the academy or while they're on the force that results in them saying the same phrase over and over again, for his safety and ours. And if that is the attitude that the police force is imparting upon, and frankly, let's talk about it, they're 18 and 19 and 20-year-old kids that are joining the police force, right? If that's the attitude that they are conveying to the police force, then that's the attitude that the police force takes into the community and has when it deals with individuals, individual people in the community. The thing about Washington, D.C. it's a 3,500 member police force. What I am not setting up is what you see in other parts of the other tensions in other parts of the country. The primary example is Ferguson, Missouri, where you have a white police force, a predominantly white police force, and a predominantly black poor community. The police force in Washington, D.C. is by and large, in terms of the patrol officers, many of them are black. So we're not talking about on an individual level, the relationship between the race of a police officer and the race of the people that they are arresting. What we're talking about is an attitude between the police force as a whole and how it approaches arrests, how it approaches investigations in the case, and how it approaches patrolling as well. From another transcript, another example. This is from a case where the police are in a car on patrol, right? When you read the transcript, when you read the question and answers, what you end up seeing here is an approach to policing in Washington, D.C., at least among certain members of the police force in Washington, D.C., that is militaristic in nature. It's not police officers walking around in shorts. They're walking around in what they are calling BDUs, battle dress uniform, right? And for them to call it battle, I mean, the bottom line is these are cargo pants, and they should call them cargo pants. They're blue cargo pants, right? And for them to refer them to as BDUs or battle dress uniforms implies that they have a perspective about what they're about to do and what they're looking for. In this case, the question had to do with, I believe that there was an assault on a police officer, a charge in this case, and maybe other charges. This preceded, it was necessary for the prosecutor in this case to get out that in order to arrest someone and then eventually convict them of assault on a police officer, a person must know that they're a police officer. You can't assault an undercover police officer and be convicted of assault on a police officer because you don't know they're a police officer at the time. But you can be convicted of assault on a police officer if you know that they're a police officer, and one of the ways that you do that is you know what they're wearing. So there is a very sort of vivid description of what this police officer is wearing. And that was necessary to establish this offense, right? What is important to know is what then he goes on to describe, which is we're sitting in our patrol car and wearing this, and two guys walk by, two black men wearing styrofoam cups. What do you do next? Well, in my experience, walking around with styrofoam cups is indicative of somebody walking with an open container of alcohol, right? It's sort of preposterous. It is a ridiculous statement to do that. And so they get out and they stop these two guys. And they stop them because they think they're drinking alcohol. Let's set that aside. Let's talk about another, another example of that sort of community policing. When Jim asked me to come down to speak I believe it was in late December or January, what he wanted to do was, what he asked me to do is find out some, or give some anecdotes of what happens in the courtroom, what we see at the Public Defender Service in DC, and how race and policing interact. By way of background, there are about 50 of us in the trial division at the Public Defender Service, although about 15 or so are the sort of very serious level felony folks, homicide and rape cases. The remainder will frequently do what I put up on the graph earlier, which is guns and drugs cases, where police are interacting with people on a daily basis, and fortuitously or not, they find guns or drugs, and those folks get arrested. So I'm talking about mostly, for a lot of cases, patrol work, and not investigations where you have detectives and they're trying to figure things out, and eventually there's a warrant that's issued and all of that type of stuff. We're talking about on-the-street patrol work. At the time that Jim asked me to come down, there were two trials that our office was handling, both of them drug cases. Both of them involving, in each case, the testimony of, in each case, 2 police officers, both of them involving what we call dropsy gun cases, where the government is alleging that the police officers see something strange, that our client runs, that our client then throws a gun. The client is arrested, the gun is recovered, they are convicted of something like carrying a pistol without a license or possession of an unregistered firearm, or at least charged with that. In both cases, the testimony went, in the first case, the testimony went as follows, along these lines. There were, I'm a police officer, I was part of a patrol that was out that night. I'm part of the vice unit. We were riding in 2 separate police cars. 4 of us in one police car, 4 behind us, 4 in another. We saw on the corner 5 guys standing there, and we wanted to see what was up. We pulled up, one of them started to run. 2 of us gave chase. He threw a gun. One of us stopped and secured the gun, stood by the gun. The other eventually caught up with him and tackled him and arrested him. I will leave aside the merits of the case and whether or not there are, that is the government's allegation, right? I will leave aside whether or not there is, the case is a case that they should have brought against our client, whether or not they should have secured a conviction. Let's set that aside. And let's think in terms of communities and policing. What did the 4 other guys that are standing on that corner think? And how are they being treated by the police when 2 police cars roll up because they're standing there? And whether or not they feel like the police are watching out for their community and treating them as people that are more customers rather than people to be suspicious of. What was striking is at the same time there was a second case where the police alleged the exact same thing. Client runs and tosses a gun. In this case, there is a police recording of one officer calling into the main dispatch. Those lines are recorded, those radio communications are recorded. And the communication went something like this. There are 2 guys standing in the parking lot of this convenience store. They have no business here. I'm going to find out what's happening, right? And then another police officer comes on and says, we're in the car over here, we're right behind you. It's preposterous, right, what happens in those scenarios. And for the police to think that that is necessary and that is the way to approach policing is a little bit ridiculous. The other sort of disturbing thing is I started to look at some of the juvenile work that we're doing. There was a case, I wanted to find it earlier. I was scrolling through my email and I couldn't find it. It was an email that came through on a Saturday when one of our lawyers was handling juvenile court for the new arrests. This is an experienced lawyer who's been in juvenile court for over a year, a year and a half or so, and has experience in the criminal justice work. And she sent out an email to several other lawyers that said something along these lines. I need to ask you guys this question. Here are the facts as the government alleges them. Bunch of kids playing cops and robbers. Some of them have guns. They are clearly toy guns with red caps on the end of them. The guns cannot expel anything. That's important because in Washington, D.C., a firearm is defined as a weapon that can expel by means of an explosive, a projectile, right? So it's important to know that the guns can expel anything. In fact, the guns are plastic and they've got a little red stopper on the end of the guns. So clearly fake. The kids are playing cops and robbers. My question is this a crime? Because her client had been arrested for this. And her question was serious. It wasn't sarcastic. It was, I don't see it. I don't know what the crime is. I don't know why my client is under arrest. And this is an experienced lawyer. And it brought back to mind the circumstances surrounding what happened with Tamir Rice in Cleveland. And it brought back to mind the fact that when the police approached children, I mean, these were kids, when the police approached children with the attitude of having to police them and not to protect them, then you are going to end up with a community that is in tension with the police force. Before I came down here today, Lynn asked me whether or not there was I had a message of hope at the end of at the end of my speech, and there on a certain level there is. One of the things that I want to do is use those examples as a way to illustrate to you. It's perspective. It's all perspective, and it's what the police are taught to do and what they're expected, what is expected of them. And I think that with further discussion, and I'll wrap up right now. With further discussion, I think that what can result from all of this is when you expose some of these examples, there is the chance that that discussion will lead to necessary change in the way that the police approach the communities that many of us and many of our friends live in. So. This, I think, goes on your. I don't see it.
I am offered a lapel mic every time I teach a class of 105 students at the law school, and I never, ever need it. So I fully expect that you will hear me, that I will hear you when you speak later. Okay, there we go. All right, so I am Lynn Spencer, and you can all hear me, right? I don't have to, I'm talking to that mic. Like Arthur, I think I will elaborate a little bit on what I have done and just a couple of things that I've learned along the way. After I graduated from college, I don't know if you mentioned, did you tell them that the entire panel went to the same undergraduate? Yeah, so we all went to Amherst College at roughly the same time. You would never guess it, but I'm actually Jim Spencer's older sister, which is why I'm allowed to say things like that. And so after I went to college, I worked at a rape crisis center and a battered women's shelter for several years, and I decided that I did that because I wanted to help people, and I felt like I was helping victim survivors, and then I felt like I was helping them only in this very narrow way, and I wanted to have more of a systematic impact, and I thought because that was the narrative at the time, that if I went to law school, I could do something great. So I went to law school and fell in love with the criminal justice system, just the law of it. And when I got out, I went to the Department of Justice, to the Civil Rights Division, and within that to the criminal section. And what that section of the department does is, or at the time, it prosecuted police officers and prison officials who used excessive force against inmates or arrestees. That was the one of our mandates. The other mandate was to enforce the civil rights statutes against racial violence. So I had some cases doing that. And then we had some church arson cases. For those of you who remember, in the 90s, there was a rash of church arsons across the country. And then I left and I moved to California, where I worked for the, I guess I should say, what I really enjoyed about that job was being part of law enforcement, but really feeling like I was serving the underdog, that I was vindicating the rights of people who wouldn't otherwise have be even paid attention to, let alone have their rights vindicated. Then I went to California, worked for the Office of the State Public Defender. As Jim said, that was representing capital and non-capital defendants. Again, very much felt like representing the underdog, and in that case I had clients who who really did need my help and had been, you know, I recognized they were convicted criminals, but they had not had easy lives for the most part. And then I went into teaching. So I thought that I would talk a little bit about the extremes of when there's conflict between communities, particularly poor communities of color, and the police. What happens in cases like Ferguson, like Garner, maybe the Tamir Rice case. For me, geographically, the big one was Oscar Grant, which was not too long ago and took place in Oakland, not far from where I live. So I thought I'd give a little bit of background, and then maybe, I mean, I don't know if it's possible to demystify the grand jury, the state grand jury results in those two cases, but maybe give you a few thoughts of mine on what happened and why that happened, why there was no federal prosecution in Ferguson, and whether there's likely to be one in the Eric Garner case. Why do we prosecute people? What's the purpose? Sorry?
I guess to prove that they've done something they should have done before we send them to jail.
That's why we have trials, and we go through the due process. Yeah, we want to prove that they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before we take away their liberty and send them to prison. Why do we send people to prison when they've committed a crime? Revenge. You know what? You're saying that like a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's true. We don't call it revenge. If lawyers call it retribution. It's the idea of punishing somebody for doing something wrong. That is one of the accepted purposes of criminal prosecutions. There's another generally accepted purpose. Deterrence, right? Those are the twin accepted purposes of prosecution. In a civil rights case, I was thinking about this, and it could be either the racial violence type civil rights case, but also the kinds of cases that we're seeing now, which I will call a civil rights case, even though they haven't been brought forward. But in police cases, often I think that you need a prosecution to allow for some kind of community healing after what has been many people experience as a traumatic event, because it's not just what makes these cases different from the kinds of cases that Arthur is working on is the entire community feels victimized vicariously by the violent event that's happened to the named victim or the primary victim. So I think both Jim and Arthur had a lot of slides about the racial disparity in policing efforts and the resulting differences in rates of arrest for marijuana or whatever. That's absolutely true, and then that brings you to the point where the prosecution part of the law enforcement steps in, where a lawyer becomes involved. Those racial disparities not only continue, but do tend to increase. The further along you go in the system, the more likely the young African-American man is to be, to continue to go through the system, while maybe the middle-class white person drops out because they negotiate a better deal, the charges are dismissed. I don't think we overlapped, but there was a time when I was in the US Attorney's Office in DC, going up against people like Arthur. And there was a certain type of defendant who didn't have Arthur as their attorney, But they had a private attorney, and that attorney would call. I remember this one in particular. This man who was accused of beating his wife, and I heard the 911 call. It sounded pretty bad. His attorney and the wife called me constantly, like, please, you just got to meet this guy. I think if you sit down and you have coffee with him, you'll see how he's really not supposed to be in the system. And I mean, you don't have that kind of time, right, to make, 11 calls a day. So finally I go down and I went to Au Bon Pain. I don't know if that's still there. And, there's this guy in this nice tie, and he's white, and he's got blonde hair, and he has a good job. And this, nice looking lawyer. And I was just like, okay, fine, take it, get out, I can't deal with you anymore. And I exercised my prosecutorial discretion to send him into a diversion program that I really think, all of those folks should have been going to, but it's the ones with that kind of like zealous advocacy with extra time, extra money, and a clean record that are going to get that kind of exercise of prosecutorial discretion. And it's that kind of discretion that leads to greater and greater disparity as you go along. So you can charge, Arthur talked about having a preliminary hearing to charge someone. What we saw in the Ferguson and Eric Garner cases was a grand jury. Has anyone here served on a grand jury? Has anyone here served on a petit jury or a trial jury? Yeah, so a couple of you, a few, yeah. I've never served on a grand jury. I don't know, I know only one person who served on a grand jury. The origins of the grand jury are actually quite democratic. It's protection against government overreaching or over prosecution. It's to ensure that community representatives are the ones making a decision whether someone's going to be charged with a serious felony. So what it's become in those cases is sort of a method of concealing a decision to charge or not charge. But its origins are pretty good. I used grand juries all the time when I worked for the Department of Justice because they were incredibly valuable in police investigations of excessive force. First of all, you could subpoena officers to the grand jury and essentially require them to testify under oath and while being recorded because the grand jury has a court reporter in there. It was helpful to me that they were secret proceedings. No one, the prosecutor's not allowed to disclose what a witness testifies to in the grand jury. The grand jurors are not. The only person who can share their testimony in the grand jury is the witness, him or herself. And that was very advantageous at the time when I did these investigations because it's hard to ask a member of a police department to come in and point the finger at another member of the police department. The stakes are really high. It makes you pretty unpopular when you snitch on a fellow officer. So to me, they were helpful. It also protects the target of the investigation in the sense that if no charges are brought, there's no public record of their having been investigated. So for innocent targets or targets against whom a case cannot be made, it's actually a positive thing. I found it useful also because the grand jurors were members of the community, the same, roughly the same pool that you'd be getting for your trial jury, and so you could see, as the prosecutor offering the evidence, I could see how they were responding to it and whether we were likely to get a conviction of, possibly a popular officer in the case if we actually went to trial. Just a little bit of background on grand juries, because I think until a year ago, people didn't talk about grand jurors. We know about regular jurors, but not grand jurors. A typical grand jury in the federal system and in a lot of the state systems, you have 23 grand jurors. 16 need to be in the room in order to have a quorum and conduct any business, which means take testimony or have them deliberate and either indict or not indict. Typically, they're the same requirements as petit jurors. So they need to be 18 years old, a citizen, without a felony conviction. That depends on the jurisdiction. You can get something like a certificate of rehabilitation in some jurisdictions so that your rights are reestablished and you can serve as a juror. In general, the result is that grand jurors are more conservative than the general population. That's the perception. People who show up for jury service because they typically cannot have any kind of felony conviction, because they need to be a citizen, they may be more conservative than the general pool. And then a distinction between grand jurors and petit jurors is that grand jurors have to serve, it's incredibly inconvenient. If you get called for grand jury service, you may need to go there every day for 2 weeks. If you get called in New York, like our mother did, she had to go downtown, I think it was 2 or 3 days a week for months during business hours. So most people can't do that. A lot of people can't do that. Who can do that?
Retiree.
Our mom, right? Our mom, because she's retired. And who else? Unemployed people, maybe, but often they're not on the rolls as much. They don't come up as often. But civil servants can, because they get paid for their jury service by their employer, and so it's not as detrimental to their finances to serve on a grand jury. So as a result, the grand jurors tend to be even more conservative than petit jurors as a universe. And just completely coincidentally, I did some research on New York grand jurors when I worked for a place called the Capitol Defender Office. And I interviewed some of the nice folks who, I guess, do the attendance for grand jury. And I asked them about how easy it was to get off a grand jury as opposed to off a petit jury. And they're like, oh yeah, we don't make anyone do grand jury service unless they want to, because it's so inconvenient. And the result of that is that you get a much less reflective pool. So whether that is behind the reasons that there was not an indictment in the Ferguson and Staten Island grand juries, I don't know. It seems possible to me. Just so that we're all on the same page, here are the charges that the Ferguson grand jury considered. First-degree murder, which would have required that they find that Darren Wilson deliberated before shooting and killing the victim. And deliberation doesn't need to be an extended plan. It can be like the space of a second or two. Second-degree murder is knowingly causing death. Voluntary manslaughter is when you is homicide in the heat of passion. Typically, in Missouri, I believe that involuntary manslaughter is defined as recklessly causing death and includes imperfect self-defense, which is when you think that you are defending yourself, you think that you have, or you have a fear of being harmed yourself or killed yourself, but you are incorrect, factually incorrect. So those are the charges that they considered but did not indict on. In Staten Island, they considered criminally negligent homicide and manslaughter. The prosecution received criticism for not putting lesser crimes charges in front of that grand jury, reckless endangerment. which is when, under circumstances evincing a depraved indifference to human life, the defendant recklessly engages in conduct which creates a grave risk of death to another person, which seems like what I saw in the video. Seems pretty factually accurate. They also didn't offer criminal obstruction of breathing, which is a misdemeanor anyway. So the next questions in those cases were whether federal charges would be brought. And here's the federal statute, which is a tricky statute. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Whoever under color of law willfully subjects any person to the deprivation of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured or protected by the Constitution shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year, or if death results, you can actually get the death penalty for this. So the Ferguson federal investigation ended in a decision not to charge Darren Wilson, and the federal investigation in the Staten Island case is still underway. When I first watched the video, I thought for sure there would be a federal indictment, and I've now watched it about 20 times. I'm not so sure. I don't know if they're going to be able to win that case. This is what I tell my students when I'm teaching trial skills. How do you win a case? You need to show both the legal elements and you have to show story elements. You have to show that in a prosecution, you have to show that the defendant is guilty of the crime, and you also have to make the jury want to convict the defendant of the crime. And you have to do all of that through admissible, credible evidence. Do you know what elements are, legal elements? I know one of you does. It's what you have to prove under the law. You have to prove these particular facts. So in this case, to show that Officer Pantaleo is guilty of a federal civil rights crime, they would have to show that he acted under color of law, which is fine because he was acting as a police officer even though he wasn't wearing the battle dress uniform. He identified himself as a police officer. You have to show that he deprived Eric Garner of his constitutional right to be free from unreasonable seizure. We can all probably agree that it was unreasonable to die during the process of being arrested. But then you have to prove that Officer Pantaleo acted willfully, which means that he specifically intended to use an unreasonable amount of force. And that was always the problem in the police cases that I handled. It's very, very difficult to prove that a police officer had the actual intent to harm the person rather than simply arrest them. And of course, you have to prove all of that beyond a reasonable doubt. So those make, so that's a high burden. It's hard to prove the legal elements. What's even worse is, or what's even harder, is proving the story elements that are part of any litigated case. And that is really about, like I said, making the jury want to convict this particular defendant. And it really is telling a compelling story. So having characters that make sense to the jury, good guys and bad guys, telling a familiar narrative, something that is going to ring true for the jury. And while we're all familiar with the narrative of some of the typical street crimes, or we're even familiar with the domestic violence type case that I prosecuted a long time ago, when the defendant is a police officer, it's a harder narrative to tell. So what is it in the Pantaleo case? What's the narrative there? Is it that he was racist? People may believe that, but you've got to be able to show it through admissible evidence. So you're going to have to develop, you're going to have to do a lot of investigation to provide that, that explanation for his conduct. Sometimes it's that the person's a bully. The events have to be explained, including why would this person intentionally kill a man while he knows that he's on a cell phone camera. And the narrative has to fit with the jury's worldview, and that may be the hardest part because just as race permeates all of the law enforcement interactions, it also permeates jury selection, and you end up, juries tend to be whiter, tend to be slightly more conservative, and they may not be receptive to a narrative about how an unemployed, overweight, diabetic, slightly agitated African-American man was the victim of a hardworking family man, local boy officer. So it ends up being very, very difficult. And you're not allowed to simply tell the story because, you know, you're in trial. You have to prove it with all of this evidence. No hearsay allowed, as we now know. And I guess I was thinking about the times when I knew that something had happened that was wrong, but I just couldn't prove it. And that happened a lot. You know, I was in that job for 5.5 years, and it happened, it felt like it was happening all the time. There was one particular case in Prince George's County in Maryland where a man, an older man, I think he was in his 50s, so he was not a young guy, and he got, oh, that's the time to wrap up. I put this on at the beginning of every class. He was stopped by the police for, you know, having a taillight out or whatever, and he ended up fleeing, but fleeing back to his house, and the police chased him up into his own attic, and he was crawling through his attic on the rafters, and I think 4 officers came after him and stopped him, and they were mad because they had, you know, had to chase him all the way into this attic, and so they started to beat him up, and he ended up falling through his own ceiling and onto the coffee table and then to the floor of his living room. The officers, some of them jumped down on top of him, some of them crawled back down, took the stairs, but they were furious by then, and they continued to assault him and until he was completely subdued, and then they arrested him, took him away. He ended up not being charged with anything because he was so badly injured during that event. The officers had no injuries whatsoever, but he was in the hospital for weeks. He had, you know, cracked ribs. Both his legs were broken. He had head injuries. So the man was really beaten to within an inch of his life, but it was all in his home, and there was no one there but these 4 officers, and none of them came forward and told the truth. They all stuck with whatever their story was. So I knew what had happened, but I could never prove it in a court of law. And there's probably nothing more frustrating for a lawyer than to feel that way or to be faced with that situation. So all of that to say, knowing the facts is not enough. You've got to be able to prove it in court. So I am not particularly optimistic about the chances of the Staten Island case going to federal court. So I don't know. I don't know how it comes out in terms of retribution. You know, whether Pantaleo is going to be punished for what, if he did something wrong, whether he's going to be punished for what he did that was wrong. I do believe there is some deterrent value to that case. I do believe that police departments are looking at themselves more carefully now. And I do believe that there is some community healing that comes out of the process of greater transparency as to a particular case. That said, I think that that you, in your current position, are just as well suited to find that community healing that is so necessary. I don't think that the criminal justice system is always the best tool for that result. I think being on the ground, working closely with communities is the better approach, because you're not as limited as we are as prosecutors, as defense attorneys, as lawyers. And then as I was listening to both of the other speakers, I was thinking, what is it that what do lawyers and planners have in common? And I think there's I came up with some ideas, actually, or at least social justice lawyers, which is how I would identify myself. We're faced with, I think there are possible solutions to what seem like really entrenched, possibly intractable problems. And as individuals, maybe we can do some of the same things. In my practice, I had to redefine success because I was always losing cases. You know, I lost as a prosecutor because juries don't want to send police officers to jail. And then when I represented criminal defendants, I lost because, you know, the deck was always stacked against me. But so what I found was that in order to be successful, this is how I had to define success to myself. Which is that you investigate, as an individual, you investigate thoroughly, no matter what side you're on. And I think that's something that planners do, too. When you're looking at whatever it is that you're dealing with, the community, the circumstance, investigate thoroughly, get your facts straight, leave no stone unturned. Listen to those who are affected most by your decisions and see the world through their eyes. Understand and define the problem accurately as the party or the community with that is most impacted understands it and defines it. And then do something to respond. Maybe it's not put someone in jail. Maybe it's not build someone exactly what they're looking for. But do something. Listen, understand, and respond. So those are my thoughts on what we all have in common and how we might have some kind of positive impact on what I really feel like is the issue of our day, the national issue of our time. So that's it for me. Thanks. And I think the idea is discussion, questions.
We got about 20 minutes to the time when we have to leave. So why don't we just see if there's questions or comments or responses?
To what extent do you think if we had, let's just say 100% of arrests actually taped using body cameras, cell phones, whatever, would that revolutionize this? You may know there was a case here in South Carolina of a state trooper who shot an African-American man, asked him for his ID, and he, in admittedly a somewhat sudden fashion, reached into his car to get it, and the officer pulled the gun and shot him. Fortunately, didn't kill him. Now, that was on film. Everybody saw it. I mean, I think they dismissed the officer. But, you know, if there hadn't been a camera, I have to think that the chances are that maybe the officer's explanation might have been accepted and nothing would have happened whatsoever. Is this going to be a big change if we have the arrests actually filmed more? I mean, but the Garner case
Yeah.
kind of raises the issue. Well, I don't know. There it was. But
I think body cameras will make a difference. For the cases that you're describing, yes. For the Ferguson case, it might have made a difference. The Garner case, obviously not. It also depends on what difference means. Like, what I'm talking about is the real extreme prosecution of officers. That's always going to be very, very rare. But I really believe in administrative sanctions within the police force. You know, I think all of those officers will be gone, so the streets will be safer because of that. I also, well, you go. You say what you think too.
Oh, okay. There's a couple of things. It depends on the perspective of the individual police force. In Washington, D.C., the police chief is very into the idea of body cameras. She thinks it'll make the communities safer and it'll make the officers behave better. And so, and the D.C. police chief is frequently at odds with the union level police officers. So, but she wants the officers to wear body cameras, and there is a pilot program going on right now where some officers are wearing body cameras. Across the river in Virginia, in Northern Virginia, there was an incident where a man was accused of essentially a domestic violence destruction of property case, where he got into an argument with his wife. His wife left the home, and he started to, did not assault her during this argument, but he started to throw her things out of the house because he was very angry. His wife called the cops and said, look, he's very agitated. Can you come and, you know, arrest him? And she was outside and she called the cops. And so the police officers showed up. And he was standing in shorts and a t-shirt at his screen door, which was shut, but you could see through. And the officers were trying to talk him out of there. They were, the wife said he does own guns. They're in a safe in the house. And so the officers drew their guns, they're pointing at him. It was a long negotiation. During the negotiation, one cop shot and killed the man. The cop says that all of a sudden he saw him, he had his hand on the screen door, he saw him bring his hand down, even though he was wearing shorts, and he shot him. Another police officer, when asked about this, and who was standing closer, said, I didn't see what that officer saw. I don't know. The rest of us were wondering where the shot came from, because it couldn't have been one of us, because we were surprised, because he wasn't doing anything. I mean, he didn't want to come out of the house, but he wasn't doing anything. That police force, I think it's Fairfax, it's either Fairfax County or Alexandria, right? That police force management is refusing to turn over to the federal investigators, the FBI, their records of that case. And there now is and the local prosecutor has recused himself and his office from prosecuting the case, saying, we work with these cops on street-level climbers all the time. The feds have to come in and prosecute the case because we have to deal with them all the time, and they haven't given us the records either. That police force has a different perspective from the Washington, D.C. police force. That police force I can see, even with body cams, right, and with the film from body cams, they're not going to turn that over. And it's not going to make a difference, even if they're required to, they're going to fight to turn it over. So, or all of a sudden you're going to have testimony like, well, I don't know why my body cam wasn't working that day. So it depends on the leadership of the police force, I think, in part. So I don't know.
I guess the other thing I was going to say is that it also depends on what you think the problem is. Whether is it that police are intentionally acting badly, or is it? I'm going to go to a slide that I didn't cover, but. Because I was going to talk a little bit about implicit bias. I don't know if this is coming up in your other classes or in your lives. I hope that everybody here has taken an implicit association test on the website. It is painful, but really interesting. Some of you probably have taken it and done the test, but this is not the implicit association test, but this guy has a video game that you can also take online that gets at shooter bias. and has revealed that most of us are more likely to see the person on the left is carrying a weapon, even though he's not, he's got a wallet or a cell phone, but because he's African American, we're more likely to see a weapon there, whereas the white man on the right, we're more likely to recognize the weapon too late. So there's all of these studies being done that are starting to demonstrate that it's actually our unconscious that is the problem rather than explicit racism. So whether body cams are going to help, I think depends on how much of an impact implicit bias is really having.
You mentioned how the police force is militarizing. I just sort of wanted your opinion about, do you think that the police force is militarizing because of these crimes happening, or there is another reason behind it, but they just need to be militarizing? And because your media encourages these crimes, it encourages smoking marijuana, and it's cool and hip to do that, and so you have this widespread in your society and you are militarizing yourself, then you have a reason to be everywhere you want. I just sort of wanted your opinion about that. Is this, that these crimes happen, then the police force militarizes, or you don't see any relationship?
So essentially the question is the relationship between crime and militarization of the police. Is that's... Okay. The crime, you know, I wish I had put up the, well, I had a graph of the crime rates in Washington, D.C. that I decided not to put up because there are too many classifications of different types of crimes. But by and large, since 2009 or 2010, crime rates in Washington, D.C. have dropped drastically, drastically dropped. And an example of that is homicide. In 2013, there were 79 homicides. In 20 years earlier, in the early 90s, late 80s in Washington, D.C., there were homicides in the 300s. So that the rate of crime generally has dropped drastically. And also the rate of violent crime has dropped drastically. There's only a couple of classifications of crime that have stayed steady, and weapons is not one, and drugs is not one. Those are cases that also where they've dropped. Is it the result of militarization or not? The answer probably is no, as far as Washington D.C. is concerned. Although I'm talking anecdotally, and I'm not able to point to a causal relationship other than sort of my own speculation about this. The reason that I say that is because what they've done is they've cut. There used to be a unit called the Gun Recovery Unit in Washington, D.C. They've drastically reduced the number of people in the Gun Recovery Unit. There aren't any fewer guns in D.C. There aren't, or maybe there are. Who knows, right? But there aren't many people getting arrested for guns in D.C. as much as they used to be. Narcotics, street-level crime, selling crack cocaine, selling heroin on the street, that has drastically dropped too. In large part because maybe my guess on that level is the changing demographics in the city. The city's becoming more affluent, and then also people are starting to realize that there was a generation of people that were severely affected by drugs, and there's a generation of their children that say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to get involved in that. So that could be the reason as well. Why the increase in militarization of the police? I can't speak other than what I have seen and I've read and heard about this, and by heard I mean like seen in reports on television, is that with the reduction of the conflict in the Middle East, with the reduction in the Iraq War, there actually was a surplus of military equipment that was then sold to local police departments, and so local police departments were trained in how to use the military equipment, and they took it. And so that would seem to me to show that there is no relationship between crime and the militarization of the police. The militarization of the police has to do with the drawdown of the war, as it were. But that is a little bit outside of my own personal knowledge, and I'm just repeating things that I've read about.
So as far as the timeline goes, I haven't kept up with it as much as I would like to have, but in Albuquerque there was a homeless individual who was killed by police in the last year. The report came out, they basically from a civilian board that said that they had too much, their training was too violent as far as how they were training police officers. As a civilian, what effective strategies can we use in order to be more involved with the way our police is relating to work? What are some effective ways that you've seen in your communities that we might, as planners, be able to engage in that dialogue with more?
Do you have any good?
I can speak to that. So the question is what can planners and on a larger basis people in the community do to sort of change the way that police approach these types of cases, like in Albuquerque where someone was killed. One of the things that Washington, D.C. does is they have monthly meetings in the different police districts. So they're called districts, they're really precincts, police precincts. And they have monthly meetings in the community at a community location. So not in the police station, but at a church or at a convention center or in a high school gym or elementary school gym, where they can tell folks in the community what they're doing and the folks can express their concerns to the police. And so when what happens is that people start to know who the commanders are. That's, maybe they can get rid of that word, but like who the commanders are and who the captains are in the police force, and who are the spokespeople and who are the liaisons with the community. And that way the community leaders can say, we're working hand in hand with the cops, and here's the problem. And so one of the more liberal areas in the Washington, D.C. area is Tacoma Park, Maryland. And in Tacoma Park, Maryland, the city council has said to the police, we are not cooperating with the federal government's search for undocumented citizens. And so you don't either. You're not pulling people over and asking for identification that would tend to establish legal presence in this country. And moreover, one of the messages that they're conveying to the community and to the police is that if you are voting in a local election in Tacoma Park, Maryland, you don't have to show your ID. You just have to say, I live here and this is where I live at. And then you're allowed to vote. And so undocumented folks can vote. And so that is a message that's conveyed to the police, and the police don't, they're going to back off on things like that. And so when you have that communication with the community that is periodic and frequent, the community can express itself and say, this is the problem. It's a problem for public defenders, right? Because what happens is that the community say, well, that guy, he's a bad dude, and then we end up with those cases. But ultimately, on a broader picture, I think that's how things could work out.
Let me comment on this, because I'm glad you bring up this question, linking it explicitly to a planning perspective. And I think about this in a couple of ways. I think I can't remember who was saying something that reminded me of the old adage, when you're a hammer, what does everything look like? Right? Looks like a nail. When you're trained in military tactics, what does every situation look like? It looks like some situation that requires a military kind of intervention. So that's one of the concerns that I have about this, whether it's because of, sort of demilitarization of the military or because of, perceived fear or whatever. The more one trains in this kind of response, the more you're going to get, right? And if you've ever been, if you've ever taken martial arts and you kind of learn techniques that give you a certain kind of advantage in terms of fighting ability or whatever, the first thing you're going to want to do is to use it, right? And it's almost uncontrollable, and that's why there's a lot of kind of built-in controls for learning these kinds of things. It's sort of like a surgeon. When you ask them what's the problem, the first thing they're going to do, let's cut, right? We've got to get in there and do invasive surgery. That's not always the best answer, but in a hospital context with a similar kind of complex set of technical and social and bedside skills that are needed for patient management and treatment, there's always a nurse or a physician's assistant or some other advocate there to say, well, you know, you don't really have to listen to what the physician or the surgeon says. Or there's a general internist over there who's being consulted at the same time saying, well, you know, there are other ways that we can do less invasive to start with, and then if we work up to surgery, well, maybe we'll do that. In police forces, you have complex situations. That example of the guy throwing his wife's stuff out on the street, I remember reading about that. In that situation, you have the person that's being accused, and you have a single type of professional, right? You have these people who are, you know, whether they're sort of, you know, trigger happy or more conservative in terms of exercising their power, they're all trained in the same thing. And so that they're all hammers looking at potential nails. As a planner, we kind of, you know, we're much more flexible. We don't have that kind of technical approach to anything, really. And if you think about working within communities, there's all sorts of ranges of nonprofit community organizations that exist there as a mitigating factor between some kind of full-on intervention and a sort of softer approach to whatever it is, right? And in that way, I think planners really have an opportunity to kind of fill in that layer, because as I see it and read it and hear about the legal system and how it deals with justice and how it deals with criminality, there's no in-between mitigator. And I think that's something where planners can begin to think, well, what would that look like from a planning perspective? What would that look like from a community development and community planning perspective? And I think that's an opportunity for us to think about, you know, in terms of meeting some of the challenges. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges facing the kinds of communities that we need to be focused on in terms of the public good. Was there another, John, did you have a question?
I can speak to lawyers. I mean, lawyers have an incredibly high or heavy ethical burden, and I think the most relevant one here is the prosecutorial burden, that to do justice rather than to win cases, which sounds kind of fancy, but it really is something that individuals should be thinking about every day as they're making those discretionary decisions that we talked about, you know, from the moment that, you know, your officer comes to you and says, I have a case for you, here are the facts, here's my report, and I really want you to charge this guy with, you know, assault with a deadly weapon, but the deadly weapon is what in DC it was shod foot, right? ADW shod foot. What does that mean? It means that the person kicked somebody, right? Shod foot. That's not, that's what? Yeah, while wearing a shoe, I'm sorry, right? Like shod, I've got a shoe on foot. So is that an ADW or is that a simple assault? So that's right, like every moment in the process you're making those decisions, and you have to think really hard about what is best for the community, what is best for public safety long term, right? Is prosecuting this person going to be good for the public safety long term versus short term? Or am I just getting carried away with my own need to advance my career, or I want to go in front of the TV and talk about how I'm tough on crime because eventually I'm going to be running for DA, those kinds of things. So prosecutorial ethics are I don't want to say they're well-defined, but there are places to look. You know, there are the model rules of professional conduct. Each state each state bar passes its own rules for professional responsibility. So defense counsel, prosecution, all lawyers should be following that. Police officers have their own code of whatever, I don't know what it is. That they, I mean, there is a code of silence. You know, I guess, yeah, like, there's a little bit of cop bashing going on here because of yeah, because of Arthur, really. No, because of the topic. But I think you're right to ask what can the community do to work, not just bash, but work to make police officers the best that they can be. And I think you're right to be asking, what is the aspiration here? What are they? What are law enforcement officers or participants in that process supposed to be doing? What is it that they're holding themselves out as being? Because it's when we get away from those aspirations and goals that we end up in situations like this. And even though we're doing it a little bit, I think demonizing entire police departments doesn't serve anyone well. I mean, I have to say that working in the Civil Rights Division where I was prosecuting police officers, I got to know so many fantastic law enforcement agents at all different levels that I learned so much from and who really were terrific role models. I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush. Now, I've gotten a little bit off topic, but I hope it spoke to your question about ethics.
It's complicated with legal stuff. It's complicated because lawyers have a very different set of ethics, and the system that we operate in is very different than what you guys are dealing with. In our system, it's adversarial. It's the defense against the government. It's the government against the defense, and our jobs are to represent our clients. In the case of the government, the individual lawyer represents the state or the people or the United States to the best of their ability, and we represent our interests of our clients to the best of our ability, and that allows for us to do things like keep secrets because it's adversarial and because the system is set up adversarially. Then we have to play a certain role within that. For you guys, if the idea is to serve the community, to plan for the community ethically, then that breaks the restrictions that we are under, and it allows for you to think sort of more holistically about how that works. And I agree with Lynn, in terms of police officers, what we're talking about is, a narrow set of police officers, narrow set of cops that do things a certain way that is just not cool, right? But there are a lot of police officers that do their jobs, and they do their jobs fine, And the reason I don't talk about things like homicide cases and sex assault cases, it's because those police officers have the experience, and they, by and large, not all of them, but by and large, they do it right. What they do is they investigate the case, they make the case. They can be heavy-handed with some people in the community, and people get annoyed with them, they get angry with them. But it's unlike the people that are looking to make arrests. They are looking where there is a case to be investigated to investigate the case. So that, to go on that aside just a little bit. But in terms of what you guys can do, it's different from what we can do. We are bound by some restrictions of professional conduct. And really it's professional responsibility. We are responsible for our clients, whoever the clients are. That's who we're responsible to. And so what people talk about being public defenders as sort of the next civil rights type job. It's the next sort of civil rights. I don't see it that way. I mean, I see aspects of it that way, but I'm interested in my one client at that one time to the exclusion of everyone else. If the community, if I represent, John Gotti, I represent John Gotti. That's who I'm interested in, and it doesn't matter what everybody else thinks, because that's my duty as his lawyer. And so you guys aren't bound by that, and hopefully what you're doing is you're looking sort of more on a more wider scale.
Let me just, because we're coming to the end here, and I just want to close by sort of saying this is not a field in which there's any kind of clear path. And I think that, Ryan, you're right to ask, well, what is it that planners can do? And I don't think there's any real answer that anybody has. But I do think that these are issues that I think it's fairly clear that the legal system cannot address. They can address individual cases. They can create some incentives for deterrence, some, retribution, revenge, if you want to call it. They can create some things at that surface level, but they don't build relationships. And it's those relationships that help mitigate some of the crisis and adversarial situations that, you've seen recently in the past year, but also since 1965, right? These are very sort of charged interactions that can be mitigated and talked down, that can be smoothed over and negotiated through without coming to a crisis point. And that is really where the planners need to be creative and need to rethink what their jobs are, I think. I think that we do what we do well, and we need to sort of take the skills that we learn in our other parts of our work and address some of the real central concerns of poor communities, which we say that we are interested in, and we are interested in, but we need to go where people's concerns are as much as we need to sort of use the skills that we're formally trained and employ them. So with that, I kind of want to just sort of thank our two guests. I want to encourage you all to think more broadly about what you're learning, about what your kind of focus is and should be when you're working with communities, and be creative about the roles that planners can play. And I want to sort of thank you for taking the time to listen to what we have to say for a couple of hours, a little bit longer than usual. So with that, let me help me thank our two guests from today.